In the last lectures, we learned a lot, including the creation of a new component by hand. Now, there also is an alternative to creating it manually. When using the CLI, you can open a new terminal window or command line, leave the ngserve window running, that's important, don't close it. And in this new window, we can use some CLI command to also create a new component. Let's say we want to have our single server component here in another component, so nested into another component, a servers, multiple servers component. We can create this manually by adding a servers folder with our component, or we use the CLI with ng, and there we have a generate command, which allows us to generate some elements supported by Angular. One such element is a component. So we can create a new component with ng generate component and then passing the name servers like this. You can also use a shortcut, and instead of ng generate component, you could say ng gc, which does the same. So if you hit enter, what this will do is it will give you a new folder in your app folder with the name of your component, servers, and in there you basically find the same files as you had for the app component. HTML, CSS, TS, and this spec file, which basically is used for testing. Now I will remove this. We'll later have a section about testing. And we'll have a look at the styling later too. For now, let's say it is in this servers component that we want to output our single server. Well, we already have this decorator, this selector, app server. So in this template of the servers component, we can override the default text with app server. And maybe simply replicate this so that we have two components, because remember, components are reusable. We can use the same component as often as we want by simply using its selector as often as we want. So now we have two servers here, and with this in our servers component, you need to make sure that you also update the app module. Now the CLI should do this automatically, which is why you already find the import and the declaration in this file, but make sure you really do have it here. With this, we can go to our servers component TypeScript file to check the selector, which is app-servers. And then we can go to our app HTML or app component HTML file and update the selector to use this new component instead of the old one. With this, if we now save this and go back to our application, it looks almost the same as before. We see our single server component twice. But if we inspect the code here in the developer tools of Chrome, for example, you see that we have this outer app servers component, this newly created component, and in between we have two single app server components. So with that, we learned a couple of important things about how to create components manually or with the CLI, how we can nest them into each other, that we can use component selectors in any other template of any other component, and how we can replicate components by simply using them, well, multiple times, using their selectors multiple times. Let's dive into how we can actually style them, what we can do regarding the style and the template of components. Thus far, we always used an external template file, and we haven't done anything regarding the styling of components. Time to change both. Now, instead of using an external template file, you can also use an inline template, which means you define the HTML code in the TypeScript code. Sounds strange? Well, it's possible. We can do this by simply going to our servers component here, for example, and right now we point to this HTML file here. Now we can change template URL to template. One of the two has to be present, either a link to an external template or just template to define it in this file, but each component needs to have a template. This is the one property you have to have at all times. So with that, now I changed it to template. Now we can write our template code here. So here we could now replicate app server like this, maybe twice, we have to make sure that we don't wrap this line because this is not supported in a default TypeScript string. And if I now save this, we see the same result as before. So it looks like nothing changed, and that is good in this case because we tried to make it look like this, but actually we did change the way we set up our template here. Now we're defining the HTML code in this same file. And actually, if you want to write multi-line strings here, which you probably want if you add more HTML code to it, you can switch from a normal string with single quotation marks to using backticks to use JavaScript template expressions to be able to write multi-line strings in between there now. So now between the opening and closing backtick, you may actually wrap the line and now write your HTML code like this. What should you use? Should you use this approach here of using template or an external file? It depends. If you have not that much code, not that much HTML code, using an inline template like this might be fine. Then you have all the logic in the TypeScript code, and that is absolutely okay. But as soon as you have, let's say, more than 3 lines of code in the HTML part here in the template, using an external file is a good idea to make it easier to follow and easier to understand. It is important, though, to keep in mind that you can use this approach, that you can inline your templates, and very important, that you need to have at least a template in a component. You can omit the selector. You will later in the routing section learn a different way of loading components without using their selector. And you don't have to add styles, but templates have to be present. So that were templates. Now let's have a look at these styles in the next lecture. We understood that templates are important and that we can either use them inline here or point to an external file. What about styles? We also have this style URLs property here, and we have these CSS files. What can we do with those? Let's go back to our app component for this. Here we got a href tag and a horizontal line. And if we have a look at our application, it's not that pretty, right? The I'm in the app component text here, or all the text actually, is sitting right on the edge here. Not super pretty. Now, since we use Bootstrap, of course, we can use some Bootstrap classes to enhance this. So we could add a div with a container class around it, then add a row, and this is just using the CSS framework, Bootstrap. So these are some CSS classes provided by this framework, nothing Angular specific. And then we could add a column here, XS12, to have one column on all device widths. Now, if we add this, we added some styling, some normal CSS styling, nothing Angular specific, and our app looks a little bit nicer now. This is great, but we can also use some tools given to us by Angular. Let's say this I'm in the app component heading here. We want to change its style. Maybe we want to give this some blue color. We can do this by going to the app component CSS file, which defines the styling for this component. And now we can use or write normal CSS code, so override the style of the href tag and set its color to some blue. So maybe to this dark blue here. If we now save this and we have a look at our application, you see it's dark blue now. This is how you can use this style file, this CSS file referenced in the app component here, to define the styles for a component. Now, just like we were able to choose between external file and inline code for the template, we can do the same for the styling. You notice that style URLs is an array here, whereas template URL wasn't. It is this because we could reference multiple external style sheets here. So you could add pointers to other style sheets. But besides that, I'm going to comment this out, you can also set up another property which is just styles. This also takes an array, but now it takes an array of strings where you define the style in this string, so now in this file. Here I'm going to use backticks again to be able to write a multi-line expression here. And then we could set up h3 here. And to really show you that this is different, I will set the color to, now let's not say dark blue, but to Dodger blue. And if I now save this and we go back to the application, you see the blue updated because now the inline style is taking over. I commented out the other one. Just like with the template, you have to decide which one to use. You can't combine style URLs and styles. But both important here has to be an array. That's the difference to template. You must only have one template. You may have multiple style files or style definitions. And you can choose between inline and external file. The rules are basically the same as for the template. If you have more code in there, using an external file is a good idea. If it's a short style definition like this, why don't you just put it into the TypeScript file? This is how you can work with templates and styles. Now, are you already a component ninja? We learned a lot about components, about the templates, options we have there, and about the styles. I want to focus on the last property we see in this component decorator for now, the selector. I already mentioned that this has to be a unique selector so that you don't override accidentally an already existing element or maybe a component made available by another third-party package you use in your project. There's one other piece of information about the selector though. You don't have to use this type of selector. Right now, our selector is the same selector as we use it in CSS for selecting an element. So we have app servers here as an element, and this is recognized by Angular because the selector we chose is app servers. And this basically just looks how you select elements in CSS, right? We select the H3 element by just typing H3 here. We select the app servers element by just typing app servers here. So that actually works like a CSS selector, and therefore you are not limited to selecting by element. You could put this into squared brackets to use the attribute selector. So in CSS, you can select elements by attribute by enclosing that attribute in squared brackets. And now if you save this, you would see that our app actually is broken, because if we have a look at the error message, app servers is an unknown element. Because now our code, Angular, doesn't recognize app servers anymore, because we changed the selector to be an attribute. So to make this work again, we would have to comment this out or remove it, and maybe add a div or any other element, a normal HTML element, which has an app servers attribute now. Now with this custom attribute added now the app works again, because now Angular selects the element by attribute and not by the element itself, because we changed this selector. Another alternative is to select by, and I'm just going to comment this out so that the code is still there for reference, to select by class. So with a dot at the beginning, app servers. Again, just like in CSS. So here we can now select by class. So let's add a new div here, which has a CSS class of app servers, which we of course could now also style. But besides that, it's also recognized by Angular as a selector, which is why we still see the app. Now, these are all options you have. As a side note, selecting by ID won't work. That's not supported by Angular. And all those pseudo selectors like hover and so on also don't work. And you typically use the element style here, app servers, for components. We will soon learn about directives, another feature where this is different. But for components, you typically create your own elements. And therefore, you don't use that style and you don't use the attribute style. Instead, you use app servers like an element, but it is important to understand that you are not limited to this, and there might be use cases where you want to use a different selector.